The morning sun crept over the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the dusty fields of Willow Creek Farm. Thomas Wilkins stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand, and looked out at the land his family had worked for 3 generations. The once thriving 80 acres of Pennsylvania farmland now looked tired and thirsty after 3 consecutive years of drought. Where corn should have stood tall and green, only scattered stalks struggled through cracked soil. Thomas took a long sip from his mug, the bitter taste matching his mood. At 42, his face had more lines than his father's had at 60. His hands, calloused and strong, gripped the porch railing as he surveyed what was left of his inheritance. Another hot one coming, he muttered to himself, noticing how the sky already had that washed-out blue look that promised scorching temperatures by noon. His dog Rusty, an aging golden retriever mix, thumped his tail in agreement from his spot on the worn welcome mat. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen table was covered with bills, bank notices, and foreclosure warnings. The latest letter from First County Bank had arrived yesterday, giving him 30 days to make a payment or face losing everything. Thomas had read it so many times he knew the words by heart. The clock on the wall showed 5:30 a.m. Despite the early hour, he was already running late by farmer standards. Thomas rinsed his coffee mug, gave Rusty a quick pat, and headed toward the barn. The old structure leaned slightly to the left, its red paint peeling to reveal weathered wood underneath. Just like everything else around here, it needed work he couldn't afford to give it. His truck, a faded blue 1998 Ford pickup with over 275,000 miles on it, sat parked beside the barn. It had been his father's before him, and Thomas kept it running through stubbornness and mechanical know-how rather than proper maintenance. The bumper sticker his dad had put on years ago, "Farmers Feed America," was now sun-bleached and barely readable. As Thomas collected his tools for the day, he thought about his grandfather, who had bought this land back in 1947 after returning from World War II. Old, black and white photos in the farmhouse showed a proud man standing before fields so fertile they looked like they might burst with life. His grandfather had built something from nothing, turning untamed land into a place that could support a family for generations, or so they had all believed. Thomas's father had expanded the operation in the 1980s, adding 20 acres and diversifying their crops. For decades, Willow Creek Farm had been one of the most productive in the county. School buses used to stop by during harvest season, so children could see what a real working farm looked like. The Wilkins name meant something back then. Now Thomas was watching it all slip away, one failed season at a time. He loaded the old tractor with supplies and headed out to the north field. Today's goal was clearing rocks from a section of previously uncultivated land. If he could expand his planting area, maybe he could increase next season's yield, assuming there was a next season. The work was backbreaking. By mid-morning, sweat soaked through Thomas's faded blue shirt as he pried rocks from the stubborn ground. Some were small enough to toss into the bucket on his tractor, while others required a pry bar and all his strength. The sun beat down mercilessly, and his water bottle emptied faster than he'd planned. During a brief break in the shade of an old oak tree, Thomas pulled out the turkey sandwich he'd made that morning. The bread was slightly stale, but he hardly noticed as he chewed mechanically, his mind occupied with calculations. How much could he get for the newer tractor if he sold it? Would it be enough to make the minimum payment the bank demanded? And if he made that payment, how would he afford seed for the next planting? His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of a car coming up the long gravel driveway. Thomas recognized the sleek black vehicle immediately. Mike Thornton, his former high school classmate and now the loan officer at First County Bank. His stomach tightened. Mike's visits were never good news. "Didn't expect to see you out here today," Thomas said, walking up to greet him as Mike stepped out of his air-conditioned car, looking uncomfortable in his button-up shirt and dress pants. "Just thought I'd stop by on my way back from a meeting in Lancaster," Mike replied, but they both knew that was a lie. Lancaster was in the opposite direction. Mike's eyes scanned the farm with poorly concealed pity. "How are things looking, Tom?" Thomas hated being called Tom almost as much as he hated the question. "About the same as when you sent that letter yesterday." "Nothing's changed," Mike sighed, tugging at his collar in the heat. "Look, I've known your family forever. I'm trying to buy you as much time as I can, but the higher-ups are getting impatient. They've already got developers interested in this land. The thought of housing developments replacing his fields made Thomas's jaw clench. This land isn't for sale. Not yet, maybe, Mike said quietly. But we both know the way things are heading. I'm just trying to give you a heads up as a friend. Friend. The word hung in the air between them. They had been friends once, had played on the same baseball team, gone fishing in the creek that ran along the property line, even dated the same girl for a while. But now Mike represented everything that threatened to take away Thomas's heritage. After Mike left, promising to see what he could do about an extension, Thomas returned to the field with renewed determination. He worked until the setting sun cast an orange glow over the land, his muscles aching and his spirits lower than they had been in weeks. That evening, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with a worn notebook, trying to make sense of his finances. Rusty lay at his feet, occasionally sighing in his sleep. The only sounds were the scratching of Thomas's pencil, the tick of the old wall clock, and the distant calls of whippoorwills outside. The numbers refused to add up to anything but disaster. Even if he sold some equipment, even if he worked double shifts at the hardware store in town during the off-season, even if he cut every possible expense, he still couldn't see a way to keep the farm. Thomas closed the notebook and rubbed his eyes. On the wall across from him hung a photo of his parents on their wedding day, standing proudly in front of the farmhouse. Both were gone now, his father from a heart attack 8 years ago, his mother from cancer just 18 months later. Sometimes Thomas was grateful they hadn't lived to see what was happening to their life's work. His brother lived in Pittsburgh with his wife and kids, working as an accountant. He called occasionally and offered financial help, but Thomas always declined. This was his responsibility now. His burden to bear. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Thomas tossed and turned, his mind filled with worries and half-formed plans. Around 3 a.m, he gave up and went downstairs. The house creaked and settled around him as he made his way to the kitchen for a glass of water. Outside the window, a nearly full moon illuminated the fields in silvery light. Thomas stood there for a long time, looking out at the land that 7 generations of his family had walked upon. His great-great-grandfather had first plowed these fields with a team of horses. His grandmother had planted the apple trees that still produced fruit along the western fence line. His father had taught him to drive a tractor in the south pasture when he was just 9 years old. This wasn't just property. It was the physical manifestation of his family's story. Every fence post, every barn beam, every inch of soil contained their sweat and their dreams. How could he be the one to lose it all? As dawn approached, Thomas made a decision. He would try one last desperate plan. The north field, the one he'd started clearing yesterday, had never been properly cultivated because his grandfather had always said the soil was too rocky and poor. But Thomas had nothing left to lose. If he could clear it enough to plant something, anything, maybe he could squeeze out just enough extra yield to buy himself more time. With new resolve, Thomas watched the first pale light of morning touch the eastern sky. He would fight for this land until the very end. Even if it was a losing battle, he would know he had given everything he had. What Thomas couldn't possibly know as he prepared for another day of grueling work was that the chain buried in that north field would soon change everything, not just for the farm, but for history itself. Thomas arrived at the north field just as the first light of day was spreading across the sky. He had barely slept, but there was a new energy in his movements as he unloaded his tools from the truck. Today he would tackle the northeastern corner of the field, an area his grandfather had always avoided. Nothing but rocks and trouble there, the old man used to say. But Thomas was out of options and out of fields. The morning dew soaked his boots as he walked the perimeter, planning his approach. This section was overgrown with stubborn weeds and small scrubby bushes that had taken root over decades of neglect. Rusty followed along, nose to the ground, occasionally startling at a rabbit or field mouse. "Not exactly prime farmland, is it, boy?" Thomas said, giving the dog a pat. Rusty wagged his tail, blissfully unaware of bank notices and foreclosures. Thomas started with the smaller bush clearing, using his machete to hack away at the undergrowth. The sun rose higher and soon sweat dripped from his brow despite the early hour. By mid-morning he had cleared enough to bring the tractor through. The ancient John Deere spluttered and protested as he guided it over the uneven ground, the plow attachment biting into soil that might not have been turned in a century or more. On his third pass, the plow struck something hard, not unusual in this rocky section. Thomas backed up the tractor and climbed down to remove what he assumed was just another boulder, to add to the growing pile at the edge of the field. He grabbed his shovel and began to dig around what looked like a smooth, flat rock. The shovel hit something that made a dull, metallic sound. "Not a rock, then. What have we got here?" he muttered, kneeling down. He brushed away the loose dirt with his hands and found himself looking at something rusty and metal. A piece of old farm equipment, maybe abandoned and forgotten years ago. As he cleared more dirt, he realized it was a chain. Thick, heavy links partially eaten away by time and moisture. Thomas frowned. What was a chain doing buried in this field? It seemed too substantial to be from farm equipment. Curiosity got the better of him. He began to dig alongside the chain, following its path. Every few inches, he'd stop to clear away dirt and see where it led. The chain continued deeper into the ground, angling downward at about 45 degrees. "This is strange, Rusty," he said. The dog had settled nearby in the shade of the tractor, watching his master with mild interest. By lunchtime, Thomas had followed the chain about 2 feet down and 3 feet horizontally. It showed no signs of ending. His back ached from the awkward position, and his stomach reminded him he'd skipped breakfast in his hurry to get started. He sat on the ground, unwrapped his sandwich, and stared at the partially excavated chain while he ate. Who would bury a chain this way, and why? The links were old, very old from the look of them, but finely crafted. This wasn't some piece of modern farm equipment. The craftsmanship suggested something from another era entirely. As he finished his lunch, Thomas noticed something unusual about one of the exposed links. Unlike the others, which were simple ovals, this one had what looked like a small symbol or letter stamped into the metal. He leaned closer, using his water bottle to rinse away the caked dirt. It was a letter W, with what might have been a small eagle above it. The mark was worn almost smooth, but still visible if you knew what you were looking for. The discovery gave Thomas a strange feeling. This wasn't just random junk buried in his field. Someone had put this here deliberately, a long time ago. His curiosity now fully awakened, Thomas abandoned his plans for clearing the rest of the field. Instead, he focused entirely on following the chain, digging carefully alongside it. The afternoon passed quickly as he worked, occasionally stopping to examine particularly well-preserved links or to look for more markings. Around 4 o'clock, the chain's direction changed. After heading steadily downward, it suddenly leveled off and then began to circle. Thomas's heart beat faster. The chain was wrapped around something. "I think we've found what we're looking for, boy," he told Rusty, who had remained faithfully nearby all day, occasionally bringing sticks to be thrown but mostly just keeping his human company. Thomas dug more carefully now, not wanting to damage whatever the chain was securing. The soil here was different, darker and more densely packed, as if it had been specially prepared. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the field, his shovel struck something solid. Not metal this time. Wood. Working with renewed energy despite his aching muscles, Thomas cleared the dirt from what appeared to be a flat wooden surface. The wood was dark with age but remarkably intact, protected somehow from the rot that should have claimed it long ago. The chain wrapped around it multiple times, secured with what looked like an ancient padlock. It was a chest or box of some kind, about 2 feet long and perhaps 18 inches wide. The craftsmanship was evident even through the dirt and wear. This had been made by skilled hands. Thomas sat back on his heels, staring at his discovery as the implications slowly dawned on him. Something valuable enough to chain up and bury this deep wouldn't be left here without good reason. This wasn't just old junk. This was deliberately hidden. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Someone was coming up the driveway. Thomas hesitated, suddenly protective of his find. After a moment's thought, he grabbed an old tarp from the tractor and quickly covered the hole and its contents. The approaching vehicle was Bill Henderson's pickup. Bill owned the neighboring farm to the west and occasionally stopped by to check on Thomas. They weren't close friends. Bill was a good 20 years older and kept mostly to himself, but they helped each other out when needed. "Evening, Thomas," Bill called, climbing out of his truck. "Saw you working this field all day. Taking on the north section finally, huh?" Thomas nodded, trying to appear casual as he walked over to meet his neighbor. "Figured it was worth a try. Not much else left to do. Bill's eyes drifted to the tarp. Equipment trouble? Just some old junk I dug up, Thomas said, surprising himself with how easily the lie came. Probably been there since my grandfather's time. Bill nodded, seemingly accepting this explanation. Well, I was heading to town and thought I'd see if you needed anything. You've been out here since dawn. I'm good, thanks, Thomas replied, suddenly eager for Bill to leave so he could return to his discovery. After a few minutes of small talk about weather and crop prices, Bill finally headed back to his truck. Don't work yourself to death out here, he called as he drove away. That land's been there 100 years. It'll still be there tomorrow. Thomas waited until Bill's truck disappeared down the road before returning to the hole. He pulled back the tarp and stared again at the chain-wrapped box. Bill was right about one thing. The box had waited a very long time. It could wait until morning, or could it? The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Thomas should head back to the house, clean up, maybe actually cook a proper dinner for once instead of just making a sandwich. The sensible thing would be to cover everything properly and come back with better tools tomorrow. But Thomas knew he wouldn't sleep a wink with this mystery literally unearthed on his property. He hurried back to his truck and returned with a flashlight, a crowbar, and bolt cutters. The padlock was ancient and probably weakened by time and elements. With any luck, he could break it open tonight. As darkness fell, Thomas worked by flashlight, carefully clearing more dirt from around the chest. The chain wrapped around it at least 3 times, secured by a padlock that, while rusted, still held firm. Thomas positioned the bolt cutters and squeezed with all his strength. The lock resisted at first, then gave way with a sudden crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet evening. Thomas jumped slightly, then laughed at his own nervousness. Rusty, who had been dozing nearby, lifted his head at the sound. Just a little longer. Boy, then we'll head home, Thomas promised, though he knew the dog would wait patiently regardless. Unwrapping the chain was harder than he expected. The links had partially fused together in places, and the metal caught on the wooden corners of the box. Finally, after nearly 30 minutes of careful work, the last length of chain slid free. Thomas held his breath as he examined the box properly for the first time. It was sturdier than he had initially thought. The wood was some kind of hardwood, possibly oak, with metal reinforcements at the corners. There was no obvious handle or latch, just a simple metal plate where the padlock had secured the chain. He ran his fingers along the edge of the lid, finding a small gap where it met the body of the chest. Using the crowbar, he carefully pried upward. The wood creaked in protest, its first movement in what must have been centuries, but slowly gave way. The lid rose an inch, then 2. Thomas set the crowbar down and used his hands to lift it the rest of the way, revealing the contents at last. The beam of his flashlight illuminated what lay inside, and Thomas gasped. The chest wasn't filled with gold coins or jewels as some hidden part of him might have fantasized. Instead, it contained something that, to the right people, might be even more valuable. Carefully arranged inside were stacks of yellowed papers, a leather-bound book, and several small objects wrapped in what looked like oilcloth. Everything was remarkably preserved, protected from the elements by the chest's solid construction. Thomas reached in and gently lifted the book. The leather binding was cracked with age, but still intact. Opening to the first page, he tilted it toward the flashlight's beam and read the faded, handwritten words. The Journal and Papers of Colonel William Hammond, 4th Pennsylvania Regiment, Continental Army, May 1777. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as the significance of what he was holding began to sink in. This wasn't just old, this was Revolutionary War era. Historical artifacts from the birth of the nation, buried on his land for nearly 250 years. And he had found them just when he needed a miracle most. Thomas stared at the journal in his hands, his mind racing. The Continental Army, 1777, the American Revolution, right here on his land. For a moment, he forgot about the bank, the drought, and all his troubles. History had been buried in his field for almost 2.5 centuries. The night air grew cool around him as he carefully examined the contents of the chest. Besides the journal, there were several folded documents with broken wax seals, a small cloth bag containing what felt like coins, and a wooden box about the size of his palm. Everything was remarkably well preserved, thanks to the sturdy chest and whatever method they had used to seal it against moisture. Thomas wanted desperately to read through everything right away, but common sense prevailed. These items were extremely old and potentially fragile. The wrong handling could damage them irreparably, and if they were as historically significant as he suspected, they deserved proper care. "Come on, Rusty," he said, carefully closing the chest. "We're taking this home." Getting the chest to his truck was no easy task. It was heavier than it looked, and Thomas didn't want to risk damaging the contents by jostling it too much. He ended up making a makeshift carrier using the tarp and some rope, then slowly dragging it to his truck. By the time he had it loaded in the truck bed, his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. At home, Thomas cleared off his kitchen table and spread out an old blanket. He carefully transferred the chest inside and washed his hands thoroughly before touching anything again. Then, with a clean dish towel beneath it to catch any loose fragments, he reopened the chest. The journal called to him first. He gently lifted it out and opened it to the first few pages, careful not to force the binding. The handwriting was different from modern script, more flowing and formal, but still readable. "To whomever may find these records, should I not return to claim them," the first entry began, "let it be known that they contain matters of great importance to our struggle for liberty and independence from tyrannical rule." Thomas read until his eyes burned from strain and fatigue. Colonel William Hammond had been part of Washington's army during the Pennsylvania campaign. His regiment had been stationed near what was now Thomas's farm during the summer of 1777, before the Battle of Brandywine. The journal detailed troop movements, supply problems, and strategy discussions that Hammond had been privy to as an officer. Around 2 a.m, Thomas reluctantly set the journal aside. He needed sleep, and he needed to think about what to do next. These items were potentially worth a fortune, but they were also irreplaceable historical artifacts. The responsible thing would be to contact experts who could properly evaluate and preserve them. But then what? Would they be taken away, placed in a museum somewhere? Would he get any compensation? Enough to save the farm? Thomas had no idea what the legal status of such a find might be. Despite his exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. Thomas's dreams were filled with revolutionary soldiers marching across his fields and bank officials in red coats trying to take his land. The next morning, he called the County Historical Society. The woman who answered sounded skeptical at first, but became increasingly excited as Thomas described his find. When he mentioned the date and Colonel Hammond's name, she gasped. "Hammond? William Hammond? You're absolutely certain?" she asked, her voice rising in pitch. "That's what the journal says," Thomas confirmed. "Why, is that important?" "Mr. Wilkins, Colonel Hammond was known to be Washington's special courier during that summer. He carried confidential communications between commanders. But his writings were thought to be lost when he was killed that winter. If this is authentic, well, this could be an extraordinary historical discovery." She connected Thomas with Dr. Eleanor Fisher, the Society's chief historian. After a lengthy conversation, they agreed that Dr. Fisher would drive out to the farm that afternoon with a colleague to examine the find. Thomas spent the morning carefully photographing each item before returning everything to the chest. He didn't quite trust that these people wouldn't simply take everything away, and he wanted some record of what he'd found. He also made one more call to his brother in Pittsburgh, who had a friend who worked as a lawyer specializing in property rights. Dr. Fisher arrived promptly at 1 o'clock, accompanied by a younger man she introduced as Professor Richard Chen from the State University's History Department. Thomas led them to the kitchen where the chest sat waiting on the table. "Before we start," Thomas said, standing between the historians and his find, "I need to know where I stand legally. This was found on my property." Dr. Fisher nodded. "That's a fair question. Generally speaking, historical artifacts found on private property belong to the property owner, unless they're Native American in origin, which these aren't. However, items of extreme historical significance..." She trailed off, looking at the chest longingly. "What my colleague is trying to say," Professor Chen interjected with a smile, "is that while these items are technically yours, their greatest value lies in their historical significance, which can only be fully realized if they're properly preserved and made available to scholars." Thomas nodded. "I understand that. But this farm has been in my family for generations, and I'm about to lose it to the bank. So while I care about history, I also care about my own family's legacy. Perhaps we can help each other, Dr. Fisher suggested. May we examine the contents first? Then we can discuss options that might benefit everyone. Thomas agreed, and for the next 2 hours he watched as the historians carefully examined each item from the chest. They wore white cotton gloves that they had brought with them, handling everything with extreme care. Their excitement was palpable, growing with each document they reviewed. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Fisher kept saying, her voice filled with awe. "Simply extraordinary." Professor Chen was equally impressed. "These maps show troop positions that were never recorded in the official military records. And these letters, some appear to be from Washington himself." As they worked, Thomas told them about finding the chain and following it to the chest. "Why would someone bury important documents like this?" he asked. "The Revolutionary period was chaotic," Professor Chen explained. "British forces were moving through this area. If Hammond feared capture, he might have hidden these documents to keep them from falling into enemy hands. He likely planned to retrieve them after the war, but he was killed that winter," Thomas remembered from their earlier conversation. "At the Battle of Princeton, according to historical records," Dr. Fisher confirmed, "he must have been the only one who knew where these were hidden. Until you found them." By late afternoon, the preliminary examination was complete. The historians had taken careful notes and photographs but had respected Thomas's ownership, returning everything to the chest. "Mr. Wilkins," Dr. Fisher said, her tone serious, "I cannot overstate the historical significance of what you've found. These documents provide unprecedented insights into Washington's strategic thinking during a crucial phase of the war. The journal alone would be considered a major historical discovery. Together with the maps, letters, and other items." She shook her head in wonder. "What are they worth?" Thomas asked directly. The historians exchanged glances. "It's difficult to put a price on historical artifacts of this caliber," Professor Chen said carefully. "Private collectors might pay a considerable sum, but these really belong in a national institution where they can be properly preserved and studied. The Smithsonian or the National Archives would definitely be interested," Dr. Fisher added, "and they do have acquisition budgets for important historical items." Thomas thought about this. "And if I wanted to donate them instead, would there be any benefit to me?" "Tax benefits for sure," Professor Chen replied quickly. "Potentially quite substantial ones depending on the appraised value and," he hesitated, glancing at Dr. Fisher, "and there could be grants," she continued, "for historical preservation of the property where they were found. This land now has documented historical significance as a Continental Army encampment site. That opens up possibilities." For the first time in months, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't just about money, though he desperately needed that. It was about purpose. His land, which had seemed like a burden dragging him down, now had a new layer of meaning. As the historians prepared to leave, Dr. Fisher handed Thomas her card. "We'd like to bring in some additional experts if you're willing. An authenticator who specializes in Revolutionary-era documents, and perhaps someone from the State Archaeological Office to examine the site where you found the chest." Thomas nodded. "That's fine. But everything stays here until we have a formal agreement about what happens next, and I'd like my brother's lawyer friend to review any paperwork." "Completely reasonable," she agreed. "We'll draw up a preliminary authentication and preservation plan for your review." After they left, Thomas sat alone at his kitchen table, looking at the chest. Rusty wandered in and put his head on Thomas's knee, sensing his master's mixed emotions. "What do you think, boy?" Thomas asked, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Did we just save the farm or find something bigger than us?" As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the kitchen window, Thomas made a decision. Whatever happened with the historical experts, the bank, or the farm, he would ensure that Colonel Hammond's legacy was properly honored. These documents had waited nearly 250 years to tell their story. Now that story was intertwined with his own. Tomorrow would bring more experts, more questions, and hopefully some answers about the true value of what he'd found. But tonight, Thomas felt a strange connection to the past, to the men who had walked his land during the nation's fight for independence, and to his own ancestors who had worked this soil for generations since. For the first time in months, he slept soundly without dreams of foreclosure or failure. The next few days passed in a blur for Thomas. His quiet farm became a hub of activity as experts arrived to examine his discovery. By the end of the week, his kitchen had been transformed into a makeshift research station with special lights, magnifying equipment, and laptops everywhere. Dr. Fisher returned with a document authenticator from Philadelphia, a silver-haired man named Robert Winters who spoke softly and wore white gloves even when he wasn't handling the artifacts. A representative from the State Historical Preservation Office came to survey the site where the chest had been found. Thomas's brother drove in from Pittsburgh, bringing his lawyer friend, a no-nonsense woman who introduced herself simply as Ms. Garza. "Your timing couldn't be better," Ms. Garza told Thomas as they sat on the porch away from the bustle inside. "The bank was ready to move forward with foreclosure proceedings. I've convinced them to grant an extension while we sort this out." Thomas sipped his coffee, watching the experts through the kitchen window. "How much time do we have?" 60 days, she replied. "But given what I've seen so far, that should be plenty." Inside, the team was making extraordinary discoveries. The small cloth bag contained 8 gold coins minted in Spain and France, common currency during the Revolutionary period. The wooden box held a brass compass and a small silver snuff box with elaborate engravings, but the real treasures were the documents. "These aren't just any letters," Robert Winters explained, his magnifying glass hovering over a yellowed page. 3 of them are signed by George Washington himself. 2 others bear the signatures of Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton. "And they're genuine?" Thomas asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Without question," Winters confirmed. "The paper composition, ink formulation, handwriting patterns, everything is consistent with documented examples from these individuals. The preservation is remarkable." Dr. Fisher couldn't contain her excitement. "The content is even more significant than the signatures," she added. "These letters discuss battle strategies that were never recorded in official documents. They reveal Washington's contingency plans if Philadelphia fell to the British. And this map," she pointed to a carefully unfolded parchment, "shows supply routes and safe houses that historians have debated for centuries." Thomas's brother whistled. "So what does all this mean for Tom's situation?" Professor Chen, who had been taking photographs of each document, looked up. "It means your brother has discovered one of the most significant Revolutionary War document caches in the last 50 years. The implications of this began to sink in. Thomas had hoped the find might be valuable enough to pay off the bank and keep the farm. Now it seemed the discovery might be worth far more than he had imagined. By the end of the week, news of the find had spread. Thomas returned from feeding the chickens one morning to find a news van from the local station parked in his driveway. The reporter, a young woman with bright eyes and a quick smile, asked for an interview. "Just a few questions," she promised. "People are fascinated by your story." Thomas hesitated, then agreed, but insisted that Dr. Fisher join them to handle the historical details. The interview was brief but thorough, with Thomas explaining how he'd discovered the chain and followed it to the chest. "And what do you plan to do with these artifacts?" the reporter asked. Thomas glanced at Dr. Fisher before answering. "I'm still figuring that out. These items are part of our national history. They deserve to be preserved properly, but this farm has been in my family for generations, and I need to protect that legacy too." The story aired that evening, and by the next day Thomas's phone was ringing constantly. More reporters, museum curators, private collectors offering to buy the entire collection sight unseen. He stopped answering calls from numbers he didn't recognize. 10 days after the discovery, Thomas sat down with the full team of experts for a formal presentation of their findings. Dr. Fisher began with the historical context. Colonel Hammond was entrusted with Washington's most sensitive communications during the summer of 1777. The British were advancing toward Philadelphia, and Washington needed someone reliable to carry messages between his scattered forces. Hammond was that person, Professor Chen continued. The documents in this collection reveal that Washington was considering a much more aggressive strategy than history records. If certain conditions had been met, he might have launched a direct attack on British headquarters. The journal contains detailed notes from war councils that were never officially documented. Robert Winters cleared his throat. From an authentication standpoint, everything is genuine. The journal, the letters, the maps all date to the period and bear the appropriate physical and chemical markers. The handwriting matches verified samples from Washington, Franklin, and Hamilton. Ms. Garza asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "And what is the estimated value of the collection?" The experts exchanged glances. It's difficult to place a monetary value on historical artifacts of this significance. Dr. Fisher began carefully. The letters signed by Washington alone could fetch between $100,000 and $150,000 each at auction, based on recent sales of comparable items. The journal is essentially priceless, Professor Chen added. Nothing like it has come to market in decades. Conservative estimates would place it at $500,000 to $750,000, possibly more given its exceptional condition and content. The maps, the coins, the personal items, together they might bring another $250,000 to $400,000, Robert Winters concluded. So in total, we're looking at a collection worth approximately $1.2 to $1.8 million at auction. Possibly more if the right buyers are interested. Thomas felt the room spin slightly. The numbers were far beyond anything he had imagined. His farm and all his equipment combined weren't worth even a quarter of that amount. However, Dr. Fisher continued, I must emphasize that breaking up the collection would be a historical tragedy. These items tell a complete story when kept together. They belong in a major museum or archive where they can be properly preserved and made available to researchers. Thomas nodded, understanding her concern. What about the land itself? You mentioned it might qualify for historical designation now. The representative from the State Historical Preservation Office spoke up. Absolutely. The discovery confirms this property as a Revolutionary War site. We've already begun the process of nominating it for the National Register of Historic Places. That status would make you eligible for preservation grants, tax benefits, and potentially tourism development funds. Thomas's brother leaned forward. So Tom could keep the farm and still benefit from the discovery? There are several options, Ms. Garza replied. Thomas could sell the collection outright. He could donate it and take a substantial tax deduction, or he could work with a museum on a long-term loan arrangement that provides both immediate compensation and ongoing benefits. The Smithsonian has already expressed serious interest, Dr. Fisher added, as has the National Archives. Both institutions have acquisition funds for important historical items like these. That evening, after everyone had gone, Thomas sat alone on his front porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and pink. Rusty dozed at his feet, occasionally twitching in his sleep. The farm looked different somehow. Not just the same fields and buildings he'd known his whole life, but a place where history had been made and preserved. Mike Thornton from the bank had called earlier. His tone dramatically changed from their previous conversations. No more talk of foreclosure or developers. Now he wanted to discuss partnership opportunities and heritage tourism potential. Thomas had politely but firmly ended the call, saying he needed time to consider all his options. His brother joined him on the porch, handing him a cold beer. Quite a week, huh? Thomas nodded, taking a long sip. Hard to believe. What are you thinking? His brother asked after a comfortable silence. Thomas gestured toward the north field, barely visible in the fading light. I'm thinking about Colonel Hammond. He buried those documents to keep them safe, expecting to come back for them. Then he died at Princeton, and they sat there for almost 250 years until I happened to hit that chain with my plow. Lucky break, his brother observed. Maybe, Thomas agreed. Or maybe there's more to it. This land has been in our family since right after the Revolutionary War. Great-great-grandpa bought it in 1790-something. Makes me wonder if there was a connection we never knew about. His brother raised an eyebrow. You think our ancestor knew about the chest? I don't know, Thomas admitted. But it feels right somehow. Like the land was keeping a secret until it was needed most. The next morning, Thomas made his decision. He called Dr. Fisher and asked her to arrange a meeting with the representatives from the Smithsonian and National Archives. Then he called Ms. Garza and asked her to draft a conditional agreement for his review. When Mike from the bank called again, Thomas finally took the call. I wanted you to know, Thomas said firmly, that I'll be paying off the mortgage in full by the end of the month. The farm stays in my family. There was a long pause before Mike responded. That's great news, Tom. May I ask how? You'll read about it soon enough, Thomas replied, and for the first time in years he felt the weight of worry lift from his shoulders. Colonel Hammond's long-buried secret had done more than save a farm. It had connected Thomas to his land in ways he never could have imagined. 6 months after finding the chain in his north field, Thomas stood in the grand entrance hall of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. The special exhibition, Revolutionary Secrets, the Hammond Papers, was opening to the public today. Beside him stood Dr. Fisher, Professor Chen, and representatives from the museum, all dressed for the occasion. Thomas felt slightly uncomfortable in his new suit, but his brother had insisted he couldn't attend such an event in his usual flannel and jeans. "Are you ready?" Dr. Fisher asked with an encouraging smile. Thomas nodded, watching as a small crowd gathered near the ribbon-draped entrance to the exhibition. There were reporters, historians, museum donors, and even a few politicians among them. It felt surreal that all these important people were here because of something he had found while trying to clear rocks from a field. The museum director stepped forward to make opening remarks. She spoke about the historical significance of the Hammond collection, calling it one of the most important Revolutionary War discoveries of the century. Thomas listened politely, still amazed by how much had changed in such a short time. After careful consideration and many meetings, Thomas had decided to donate the entire collection to the Smithsonian. In return, he received a substantial tax credit that more than covered his debts, plus a generous finder's fee that recognized his role in preserving the artifacts. The agreement also included provisions for a permanent exhibition at the County Historical Society back home, bringing tourism to the area, most importantly to Thomas. His farm had been officially designated as a National Historic Site. The designation came with grants for preservation and development of educational programs. What had once been a struggling family farm was now both a working agricultural operation and a historic destination. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he kept his remarks brief, as public speaking had never been his strong suit. "I'm just a farmer," he began simply. "My family has worked that land for generations. When I found that chain, I was just trying to save my farm from foreclosure. I had no idea I was about to stumble onto a piece of American history." He paused, looking at the eager faces in the crowd. Colonel Hammond buried these documents to keep them safe during a dangerous time. Then he died at Princeton before he could retrieve them. For almost 250 years, they waited underground on my property. I like to think they were waiting for the right time to be found. After the ceremony, Thomas toured the exhibition. The museum had done an extraordinary job. The chest sat in a special climate-controlled display case at the center of the main room. Around it, the documents were beautifully presented with interactive screens allowing visitors to explore translations and historical context. A large wall map showed the location of Thomas's farm in relation to Washington's movements during the summer of 1777. One display particularly touched Thomas. The museum researchers had discovered that his family's connection to the land began earlier than he had known. His great-great-great-grandfather, a Revolutionary War veteran named Joseph Wilkins, had purchased the property in 1789 from a cousin of Colonel Hammond. While there was no evidence Joseph knew about the buried chest, the connection across centuries felt meaningful. As Thomas prepared to return home the next day, Dr. Fisher handed him a small package. "The museum had this made for you," she said, "a token of appreciation." Inside was an exact replica of the compass found in Colonel Hammond's chest, beautifully crafted down to the tiniest detail. "The original will help guide visitors through history," she said. "They thought this one should guide you through whatever comes next." Back home, life had changed in ways Thomas could never have imagined. The bank mortgage was paid off in full. The farmhouse and barn had been repaired and painted for the first time in decades. New equipment stood ready in the fields, replacing the aging machinery he'd struggled with for years. But the biggest change was the new visitor center being constructed near the entrance to the property. Built in the style of an 18th century barn, it would house exhibits about both the Revolutionary War history of the site and its agricultural heritage. The north field, where the chest had been discovered, was now marked with educational signs and a walking path. Thomas had hired Bill Henderson's son from the neighboring farm to help manage the agricultural side of the operation. Young Pete Henderson had studied agriculture in college but couldn't afford to start his own farm. Now he brought fresh ideas and energy to Willow Creek Farm, implementing sustainable practices that were both environmentally sound and more profitable. The County Historical Society had become a partner in developing educational programs. Local schools already booked field trips for the following spring. eager to show students how history could be literally right beneath their feet. On a crisp autumn day, almost exactly 1 year after finding the chain, Thomas walked the property with Rusty. The old dog moved more slowly these days, but still enjoyed their daily tours. The trees were ablaze with red and gold, and the newly harvested fields stretched out around them. They stopped at the spot where it had all begun, now marked with a simple stone monument. Thomas sat on a bench installed for visitors and scratched behind Rusty's ears. "What do you think, boy? Did we do the right thing?" Rusty looked up with trusting eyes, as if to say that of course they had. Thomas thought back to his lowest point, when the bank was ready to foreclose and he'd felt like a failure to his family's legacy. Now, ironically, he'd preserved that legacy in a way none of his ancestors could have imagined. The farm would never be a large commercial operation like some in the county, but it would survive and thrive in its new dual role. Future generations of Wilkinses could continue working this land if they chose to, or pursue other dreams knowing their heritage was secure. That evening, Thomas hosted a small gathering for everyone who had helped along the way: Dr. Fisher and Professor Chen, Ms. Garza, Pete Henderson and his father, his brother and sister-in-law who had driven in from Pittsburgh, and a few neighbors who had supported him through tough times. They gathered in the newly renovated barn, with its original beams now restored and strengthened. A catering company from town had set up a buffet dinner, something that would have been an unimaginable luxury a year ago. As they ate and talked, Thomas looked around at the mix of people: academics and farmers, locals and out-of-towners, young and old. The conversation flowed easily between topics: crop rotation techniques, Revolutionary War history, plans for next year's programs, town gossip. Thomas's brother raised a glass. "To Tom," he said, "who saved more than just a farm." Later, after the guests had gone, Thomas walked out onto the porch with a cup of coffee. The night was clear, stars brilliant above the open fields. In the distance, the lights of passing cars moved along the county road. More traffic these days, as word of the historic farm spread. He thought about Colonel Hammond, who had hidden those precious documents and never returned for them. Had he somehow known that they would be found when they were most needed? It seemed unlikely, yet Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there was more than mere chance at work. The compass replica sat on the porch railing where Thomas had placed it earlier. In the moonlight, its brass case gleamed softly. He picked it up and opened it, watching the needle swing around and settle, pointing north, always north, steady and reliable no matter how much the world changed around it. Thomas smiled. Like that compass, he had found his true direction. The farm would continue, adapting to new purposes while honoring its past. His family's legacy was secure, and somewhere, he liked to think, Colonel Hammond would be satisfied that his long-hidden treasure had finally fulfilled its purpose. Not as a weapon of war, but as a bridge between past and future. The chain that had caught his plow on that desperate day hadn't just led to buried treasure. It had linked Thomas to history, to a broader purpose, and to a future he could never have envisioned for his family's land. As he headed inside for the night, Thomas left the porch light on, a habit he'd recently developed as the farm welcomed more and more visitors. Willow Creek Farm was no longer just his home. It had become a place where others came to connect with history, to learn and to remember. The light would stay on, guiding them in, just as that buried chain had guided him to a new life.